Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us, coming at you live with another broadcast from Florida F.I.R.S.T Institute in Orlando, Florida. Today's broadcast is going to be a little bit different from the Mario Kart stream that we did last week. We're going to have a Rock Through the Ages seminar instructional of sort. I'm going to be your host, Christian Porter, today, and we are joined by the guitar guru, the rock and roll historian himself, Mr. Cameran Arteman. Cameran, thank you for joining us.
Yes, thanks for having me, guys. I'm honored.
So for today's interview, the way it's going to go, we're going to learn a little bit about our guitarist, our speaker here first, talk about his backstory, get his input on some things. After that, we are going to go through the history of rock and roll, going through the ages. So we're going to start from the 50s, maybe a little bit earlier than that, and work our way up to current time. At the end of getting to the current time, we're going to discuss a little bit of the future of rock and roll and what we think is going to happen next with Cameran. And then after that, Cameran's going to play us out with a song that is special to him, and during that song, it'll be a blues song. Cameran's going to play it in all the different ways that guitar is played throughout the decades. So you'll kind of see it progress as he goes through the song. Once he's done with that, we're going to take a quick break, and then we will be back for one more segment where we're going to discuss the guitars he's brought on stage with us, talk about the different styles of guitars, how they're played, how they can be used. And then after that, Cameran will play us out, and that'll be the end of it. So without further ado, we'll start getting into it. Cameran, thank you very much for joining us today. To start off, if you could give us a little history into how you got into playing guitar, because from what I understand, you don't come from a musical family. There's nobody there that plays anything. So tell us a little bit how you got into it.
So my first earliest inspiration was my uncle. He played mainly acoustic, and honestly, I just wanted to play acoustic just because of him. So my mom went out and bought a nylon string guitar, which is like a Spanish guitar, at a garage sale, and it was all beaten up or whatever. And then I just kind of, I played it once, learned the Star Wars theme or whatever, and then I threw it in the garage or the room or whatever, and I just didn't touch it. And then I guess in 2017, 2018, I bought a Stratocaster, which is an electric guitar, online. And ever since then, I've been playing, and I've been getting better and better. And then my uncle, he listened to me play one day. He was like, "Hey, I want you to, I want to play with you. I want to jam with you or whatever." And then I was like, "Yeah, whatever." So I just kind of pushed that to the side because I wanted to get better and better at guitar, so I can, know what he's talking about with all the chord changes and the progressions and whatnot. And then shortly after, he got cancer, and then it was the last Christmas he had was 2019, and we went there Christmas Day, and he's like, "Hey, next time you come over, you should bring your guitar." And I was like, "Yeah, I will do that." And then August 2020, he passed away, unfortunately.
So a little bit of a sad story, but something more meaningful maybe when you play the guitar. When you play, it's not just a hobby for you, as we've kind of discussed before this. What is it to you?
Guitar is it's a way of therapy, in my opinion. Because if you're angry, you could, just play angrily, I guess. And then if you're sad, you could play sadly and whatnot. But it's therapeutic. So if you're going through something and you pick up an instrument, you can feel the pain and the suffering that somebody's been going through when you hear them play, guitar, right, or drums, or even the trumpet and whatnot.
So it's a very emotional experience, and do you use it in a way to kind of clear your head of things?
Yeah, there's literally been days where I just play the same chord over and over again, and that's just the way that I, think. Like some people, they dribble a basketball for hours on end, and I just play guitar for hours on end, so I can, it helps me process things a lot clearer.
And as you said before, it's not a hobby, it's a lifestyle.
I said that jokingly, but yeah, it's getting to that point.
It's a serious thing for you, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be famous or anything from it, but it's serious enough for me to, show my friends how to play guitar and the riffs that I play and whatnot. Yeah.
So you say you don't want to go pro or get famous or anything like that, but you are interested in maybe having a band and being able to play with other people and just kind of noodle around.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind doing club shows, but anything like arena or anything like that, I just probably wouldn't touch that because I don't want to be, famous or whatever. I just want to be some kid in the garage, noodling around.
Yeah, having fun with it.
Yeah.
So in your opinion, I'm going to go off script here and ask some different questions. In your opinion, of course, if you're going to ask somebody who plays guitar or is into rock and roll, you're going to say, who are your favorite, who are the greatest? that being aside, who is your personal Mount Rushmore, maybe 4 or 5 artists or bands where they're a big template for the music that you play?
Okay, so the first one is Eddie Van Halen.
Of course.
Of course. Because just the way he introduced tapping in 1978, we'll get in that later, it just kind of revolutionized the guitar world. He innovated it. He took a basic blues lick and then he reinvented it and it became tapping. My second one would probably be Jack White, because the way that he just brought back blues and punk rock in the early 2000s and the Black Keys and all that came from that was just, amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And third would probably be Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin, just because he's like one of the first heavier guitarists out there. And then the fourth would be Jimi Hendrix, because he definitely changed a few things in the guitar world when he played for that brief moment.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fifth would probably be Alex Lifeson from Rush, because the way he plays is just so fluently, and he's also classically trained, and it's just crazy the way he plays.
I know I'm going to try to make the comparison for me to understand and maybe for the audience. Coming from a soccer background or kind of any sport where anything's professional, when someone makes it look easy is when it's the most appealing, or when you know that person's really got it. Yeah. The gentleman you mentioned from Rush, is his playing kind of like it's so flowy, so easy coming to him, like you can just tell that he's totally in it?
Yeah, you can definitely tell that it's just, he makes it look easy.
Yeah.
Like,
okay. Yeah.
If you try to look at the tabs or the chord structures, you can be like, what the heck is going on here?
Right.
But then you look at him live and he's playing it like it's nothing.
With those people being listed, and it doesn't have to be any of those people, is there anyone that you kind of follow after, is maybe like the one guy where you're like, I kind of model myself after him sort of thing?
Well, with like my gear and whatnot, I try to stay in between the blues and the metal, because if you can get the blues down, you can pretty much play anything.
Mm-hmm.
And then personally, I probably follow off of Dave Grohl from the Foo Fighters and Nirvana, because he didn't really have a musical background and he didn't know how to play guitar, and he just picked up a guitar and he wrote one of the best rock songs of all time, which was Everlong.
Yeah. So okay, nice.
Yeah.
I like that. Before we move on, I've been thinking about it, and we haven't gone over it, but I'm interested. Is there any kind of special story behind that guitar specifically?
So it is it's not made in 1978, but it's called D78 Frankenstrat, and it was a graduation gift from my parents when I graduated high school. And ever since that, I've been just using it for everything.
Okay, nice. Well, with that being said, we're now going to start moving into the program, getting into the history of rock and roll and moving on. So, starting with it, we're going to get towards the 50s here, late 40s, early 50s. If you could explain the beginning of rock and roll and specifically what Robert Johnson has on the impact for it.
Robert Johnson was a huge blues player back in the 20s and the 30s. And so basically the story goes, it's, a tale, but he was so bad at guitar, like even his friends tried to stay away from him as a person, because he would just pick up the guitar and it would sound awful. And then one night he left allegedly to sell his soul to the devil for 3 days at a crossroads.
Mm-hmm.
And then he came back and he was the best player in the world. He knew every single lick, everything. And he wrote one of the best, in my opinion, one of the best blues albums of all time, which is The Devil in the Crossroads.
Okay. So, before we go any further, I forgot I wanted to bring this up. You had mentioned before that the elements of rock and roll and the fundamentals of it, like with any kind of genre of music or any kind of art, there's always a blueprint or a template from way, way before that you build off of to increase from that. Can you explain the impact of Beethoven that he has on rock and roll?
So Beethoven, a lot of the influence from Beethoven actually kicked in around late 60s, early 70s when Black Sabbath and all the other metal bands from the UK started coming over. And a lot of the riffs that they would play would be Beethoven backwards, and they would add their own rhythm. So like Beethoven kind of took this classical element, and everybody's like, classical piano or whatever. And then classical guitar had a phase in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And of course, there was a lot of classical guitarists around that time, and they trained their peers, which happened to be, famous guitarists that we know of today, like Randy Rhoads, Alex Lifeson, and even Yngwie Malmsteen.
Okay. So rock and roll, now coming back up to the 50s, getting back up to speed, coming from the blues, can you give us an example of a blues song that would come from that?
Okay, so the standard blues song is very easy. It's just usually 4 chords, but it usually goes...
So you've got Robert Johnson coming onto the scene with the blues. Can you, how do I want to put this? So that serves as a template for a lot of rock and roll, well, rock first of all, coming up in the future with people as big as Chuck Berry, Elvis, very heavily influenced by rock. Blues is a big background of his. Can you explain the evolution from Robert Johnson's blues rock to Chuck Berry coming onto the scene?
So Robert Johnson, he was from Mississippi, and he had a short-lived career. It was only like 2 or 3 years, and then he died. But a lot of blues musicians from Chicago and even down in Mississippi and Louisiana and whatnot took inspiration from his album and record. And throughout the 30s and 40s, we had like other blues musicians like playing in clubs and whatnot, like trying to recreate what he did. And that kind of got heavier and heavier. And then the 50s came along, and Chuck Berry, he took those blues riffs that were really slow and bluesy and sad, and he sped them up a bit. And that became the foundation of rock and roll.
So could you maybe give us a demonstration or example of going from blues to progressing into rock and roll, the difference between the sound?
So blues, it usually uses the standard blues scale, and it's usually like... And then rock and roll kind of just took those licks from the blues scale and they sped them up. So like for Chuck Berry, it was Johnny Be Good, and it was like...
So much. So moving on from the 50s to the 60s, you kind of have that happier-go-lucky kind of sound, like you said, speeding things up, kind of lots of like dance music, pop kind of music. So now we're getting to the 60s. The 60s, the evolution of rock, it kind of goes for a heavier sound. Could you explain for the audience how they progressed into that sound?
Okay, so around the 50s and 60s, that's when the Beatles and the Rolling Stones came out, and they had a crunch tone. I'll explain that later. And kids in the United States wanted to recreate that in their garage. But obviously, a lot of them weren't trained properly to play instruments, so they created, their own songs. And a lot of it was very rebellious, and it was pretty much the precursor foundation to, as we know it, as punk. And a lot of their riffs. So basically, I'm going to show you what the crunch was. So basically, back in the 50s, they didn't have distortion or any of that, so it was all clean tones like. And then the punks came around, and they would take knives, like usually kitchen knives, and they would slash the amps, and that would cause a crunch tone. It would sound like. You'll see a lot of Chuck Berry riffs in the early 60s and even so on, because he inspired pretty much everybody around that time.
So Chuck Berry kind of started the wave for that. Would you say, as we're going to get into later on, kind of referring to some things coming later, how Van Halen ends up being the template for all rock and roll moving forward? From now until Van Halen, is Chuck Berry like the gold standard for that?
It was Chuck Berry, and then Hendrix came along, and he started playing his guitars backwards because he was left-handed. And he's creating all these different chord shapes, and he made a whole bunch of solos. Like, for example, Woodstock, he played the national anthem, and that is widely regarded as one of the best live performances of all time. And then it would be Van Halen, yeah.
So, of course, you can't talk about the 60s and rock and roll without having the Beatles in it. Can you elaborate for us how the Beatles, why, we know they were a big deal, Beatlemania, everybody, but can you explain why they became such a big deal?
So the Beatles, everybody in the U.S., music was very segregated at the time. So like we had the blues for, and then we had the R&B and whatnot. And then when Chuck Berry came along and kind of blended that those two together, and also Elvis blending those two together around the same time, it kind of created an impact on both cultures, and it created something called, as we know it, as rock.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the Beatles came along, they were from the UK, so they kind of knew what was going on, but they didn't at the same time. The Beatles started out as like a washboard group, so like, you know, very country and Western sounding. And then they got a new drummer during a recording in Germany, and that was Ringo Starr, and they became the Beatles. And then so on, they went to the Ed Sullivan Show. He was kind of like the Conan O'Brien of back then. And they pretty much created Beatlemania overnight because of that show.
So, getting specific about it, because I know as time progresses with rock, we get to a lot more subgenres of it, like with any kind of thing. The subgenres of hip-hop now is in like the millions, and
Yeah.
rock is kind of the same thing. What specific rock genre would you call the Beatles at that time?
So the Beatles in the 60s, I consider that as rock and roll. And then when you progress to like Let It Be and all those other songs, I consider that as psychedelic rock.
Okay, so their genre, specific tone and sound changes over time.
Yeah.
It's not just the same.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Would you say for bands progressing, I know, once again, we're going to speak about in the future, with Van Halen, they changed their genre to progress with the times. Do you personally think, for rock and roll, that for you to be able to go further and have a longevity of a career, that you have to be able to adapt and change your style?
Yeah, I mean, just look at the Foo Fighters. They're probably one of the last rock bands that are still kind of relevant because they kind of adjusted their sound to the times.
Mm-hmm.
Like once they got to the early 2010s, they sounded more poppy and more heavier than what they used to do. And then, yeah, that just kind of makes them relevant still.
So you don't think there's any way that, you know, there's always diehard fans of a certain person or band or something, and it's always going to, like, you know, how long are people going to be fans of Michael Jackson and Elvis? Like, forever those guys are going to be big.
Yeah.
You don't think there's any kind of rock and roll bands that will always stand the test of time, or do you have to change and adapt to stay relevant?
Honestly, you got to just stick to your gut. I mean, a lot of people do change over time. Like, for example, the Foo Fighters, and also Van Halen is another good example. They kind of, like, during the mid-'80s, they kind of realized the heavier stuff was kind of dying out a bit, so they switched to more of a pop thing with Sammy Hagar. And then, yeah, I mean, it just depends on your gut, depends on the record label, depends on a lot of stuff, actually.
So still on the topic of genres, coming out from the 60s, what are major genres that become onto the scene?
So we have garage rock. They're the precursor to punk. Psychedelic, which is the precursor to progressive rock. And then we just have standard blues, and then the rock and roll movement, and then rock and roll is kind of slowly dying out, and it becomes just rock.
So could you go further into each of those genres to kind of dumb it down for our non-musical audience to understand? So for garage, give the history and backstory on that.
So garage was the amp slashing, and the kids were rebellious towards their parents and towards, you know, the government. So they would slash their amps and whatnot to get a heavier tone. Psychedelic, they used a lot of effects, mainly the phaser, and it was meant for, like, you know, trips. And then rock and roll was still rock and roll with the clean tones, and they're slowly adapting to the times with Jimi Hendrix and whatnot. And then once Jimi Hendrix came, everybody changed pretty much.
Can you explain surf rock?
So surf rock is very interesting. Dick Dale is probably the main surf rocker out there.
Okay.
And one of his songs, actually, Misirlou, was a huge inspiration for the garage rock movement and other stuff. And Misirlou goes like this.
So with that, with that being said, you brought up psychedelic rock and the distortion of sound and how it's different. Also coming into the 60s is the pedal board, making a big difference to the game. Can you explain the effect the pedal board has on psychedelic rock?
So psychedelic rock, specifically Jimi Hendrix, for example, he used a lot of wah pedals and phasers. So the basic phaser sounds a lot like this.
So with the pedal board being introduced to the game and also changing rock in the mid-60s, I think nowadays in our time, psychedelic rock is kind of a big genre, kind of going with indie and alternative. Can you give me the forefathers for psychedelic rock and what they meant to the genre?
So psychedelic rock, it started with the acid trips and the hippie movement back in the 60s. And then it kind of slowly progressed into heavier stuff like Pink Floyd and Hendrix. And then Pink Floyd pretty much was a foundation for progressive rock. And then progressive rock kind of evolved into metal a bit. And then now, since the early 2010s with Mac DeMarco and the Deftones and Tame Impala, it's kind of slowly coming back with the indie scene.
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up next is like Pink Floyd, Tame Impala kind of like influence, which if you don't know about that, we'll get into that in the future as well. So once again, can't talk about the 60s without the Beatles, and you also can't talk about it with the Rolling Stones. Those are the two big bands coming out of the era, and whether they have beef or anything with each other, people are always going to put them in the limelight of one versus the other like you would with athletes. Can you explain the give and take and contrast and compare of the Rolling Stones and the Beatles?
So the Rolling Stones, they were a bit heavier with Paint It Black and all this other stuff. It was very anti-war for the time, and a lot of it wasn't really consumer friendly for the time. And then the Beatles came, they had songs like Love Me Like You Do and all that other stuff. And then the Rolling Stones just got heavier and heavier, and since they came around the same time, the fans kind of divided. And it caused like you're either a Rolling Stones fan or a Beatles fan, kind of like Star Wars or Star Trek.
Yeah.
And like literally back then, if you went to a Rolling Stones concert with a Beatles shirt, you'd probably get jumped.
Oh wow! All right.
Yeah.
So, what is the main? So we've talked about the Beatles genre. Can you explain the Rolling Stones genre?
So Rolling Stones kind of was the precursor to Jimi Hendrix and all that with the, Overdrive and whatnot. And then once they kind of did their own thing, Hendrix came along, and then the Rolling Stones died out for a little bit. And then they came back in the 70s, and they were more of like a funk pop. And then the 80s came along, and they were more like the Dire Straits, where it was like rock and roll, but it's also funky in a way.
Yeah. So would you say, now getting towards the tail end of the 60s, another big band that comes out is Black Sabbath with Ozzy Osbourne.
Right.
Would you say the Rolling Stones kind of walked so Black Sabbath could run, or what helps bring Black Sabbath onto the scene?
So Black Sabbath, it was originally a country band with a blues style to it, a lot like Hendrix. And this is around the time Hendrix was popping off in the UK and whatnot. And Black Sabbath, the band, went to go see Alfred Hitchcock movie. And I believe it was Crows, I'm not entirely sure, but they saw the movie and they're like, we need to make music that's scary, because if you can make movies that are scary, you can make music that's scary. And then they got brainstorming and they came with one of the best, rock bands of all time, which was Black Sabbath.
So with it being scary music, a lot of heavier, more drawn out sounds, does that create its own genre in itself?
Yeah.
And what genre would that be?
That would be metal.
So could you give us examples of those early songs from Black Sabbath?
Yes.
So we had sort of touched on the somewhat rivalry between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Those other bands coming out at that time who are really making a difference to the music game, is there any contention between them, or is it everybody's kind of respected in their own lane?
Everybody's kind of just respected in their own lane, because rock and roll was still kind of being born back then, so they were still like
Figuring it out.
Still figuring it out, yeah.
There's no rivalry if you don't really know what you're doing. So
That's true.
like everybody's kind of doing their own thing.
Yeah.
So now getting towards the tail end of the 60s, a lot of bands coming out, changing the game, bringing something new to it, new styles of being played. Can you explain Led Zeppelin?
Led Zeppelin, they were very heavily influenced by Robert Johnson and the Chicago blues back in the 40s and 50s. And a lot of their riffs actually were inspired by that, especially their songs. They had quite a few covers of songs. I believe Whole Lotta Love was a cover of a blues song from the 30s.
Okay.
And A Whole Lot of Love is probably one of their most notable songs aside from Stairway to Heaven, but
Right.
yeah.
So what genre of music do they have?
So this is actually a huge controversial take, especially in the guitar world, but I consider them as metal.
Metal?
As well. Yeah,
Okay.
like early metal, yeah.
So how would you stack them up against Black Sabbath at the time?
So Led Zeppelin was still kind of in between like the Jimi Hendrix stuff and the Black Sabbath stuff. Like they had a lot of really heavy licks, but they weren't there yet.
Right. So getting towards the end of the 60s now, what band or person possibly would you say was the most, everybody brings their own thing to the game, of course, it's not just one person doing it, but would you still stick with probably Jimi Hendrix? Who brings the most to coming out of this time period?
So this is also another controversial opinion, but
okay.
Honestly I think Carlos Santana was probably the most notable guitarist out there.
Santana, okay. And is he solo or?
Yeah, a little bit. He played with Santana's band for a bit, and then he broke up with the band, and then they got back together again, and then so on. But he plays solo as well.
Okay. So Santana contributing the most. Could we come back to Led Zeppelin and how they compare to the Rolling Stones? Could you give us, or not the Rolling Stones, Black Sabbath, could you give us an example of their music?
So Led Zeppelin is very blues heavy, so a lot of it kind of still goes like... And then Black Sabbath was a bit heavier, so it'd be like...
All right. So a little bit similar in their taste, but one's still kind of holding on to the more bluesy kind of sounding music. Okay, so we're at the end of the 60s now, progressing into the 70s. 70s is what genre or genres would you classify the 70s as? Is it like full blown, we're in metal mode now?
So it's going to get a little spotty there. So early 70s was still in the blues phase with Led Zeppelin and Santana and all those other bands. And then mid 70s disco kind of came in and kicked out rock and roll for a minute, and then pretty much Van Halen and other bands that were playing on the Sunset Strip, we will get to that later, kind of kicked disco out and killed it overnight and then brought back rock and roll.
Are there examples, either like bits of songs or chords that you could play that could kind of give us, before we get into playing more music and heavier songs, kind of give us like a taste of what is becoming of that music during that time?
Yeah, so a lot of the riffs, they were funky, but they were also heavy. So they would go like... And then sometimes they would add the wah pedal and it would go...
So that is reminding me or making me think of, earlier we had talked about psychedelic rock and the introduction of the pedal board and how integral that was. In the 70s, are they still building off of the pedal board? Is it still such a big deal to them, or what's...
Yeah, a lot of effects came out in the 70s. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of them with me, but there's octaves, so you can make your guitar sound an octave lower and it sound like a bass. And then there's, of course, like more phasers and more like their own brands of amps coming out and whatnot.
So it's not forgotten about. It's still progressing with the rest of it.
Yeah.
Okay, got you. So let's see here. So for metal, getting back into metal, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, could you explain the genre of metal? Why is it called metal?
So the oversimplified version is because it's heavier than rock.
Okay, just the sound.
But yeah, it's literally heavier than rock. They take the blues stuff and they add distortion to it, and then it just sounds heavy.
So sort of like the late 50s, early 60s, you're starting to get those new genres where everybody wants to jump on board and become the next thing. In the 70s, same thing, it's going to happen through every decade. The 70s, it happens as well. AC/DC ends up coming onto the scene with that kind of music. Could you give us a little backstory on them?
So AC/DC, it was Angus and Malcolm Young. They started in 1974. Their first Live Wire was their first album, and pretty much one of my favorite albums of all time. And it was very bluesy, but it was also, it had that kick to it like the Rolling Stones had. And they were Scottish kids, but they moved to Australia when they were younger, and they kind of formed the Australian rock scene, and then moved to the U.S. and became AC/DC.
When you say forming the Australian rock scene, is there a definitive difference between rock from different continents and different countries, or is it all kind of like a unison thing where it sounds the same?
Well, around this time, since there wasn't a lot of internet or television, it was more like each continent had their own thing. Mm-hmm. And then once the television became widely known in the 70s, that pretty much is when it opened up, especially with MTV and all this other stuff coming out.
So sort of like we had spoken with the Beatles getting big on Ed Sullivan, obviously you have the radio and selling records, but is that kind of the marquee for wanting to get your brand and your music out there, is getting on a MTV or a TV show?
Yeah, back then, because that was kind of like the internet of, like the front page of YouTube back then. So like if
Yeah.
you hit there, you're good.
Yeah, okay. So I don't want to forget, because I like this story. Can you explain the AC/DC playing the same 4 chords and they have the song High Voltage?
So AC/DC, those are also guitar chords that you can play. Mm-hmm. Their song High Voltage, their chord progression is literally AC/DC. And that's probably one of, out of their 300 songs that has that chord progression. And it's just kind of silly that AC/DC would make a song with the chord progression AC/DC.
AC/DC, yeah.
Yeah.
Could you play that example for us?
Yes.
So we had just spoken about that song being played in AC/DC, but for the majority of their other music, it's also played in the same kind of foundation laid, same 3 chords. Can you explain that for us?
So another song, a couple of songs that use the same 3 chords. It's Dirty Deeds and also TNT. So Dirty Deeds goes. And then TNT goes.
So as I've noticed throughout the time that we've talked, a recurring theme between bands coming onto the scene is it seems like a lot of beginnings come from blues music. So you talked about AC/DC, Led Zeppelin, and just about every time you've named somebody, you've said they started as a folksy blues band and kind of progressed into it. Is that a common theme for bands coming onto the rock and roll scene?
Yeah, essentially.
Okay, because that's where it comes from. That's the foundation for it, so you kind of build off of that. So
It's
that's
the
the
brick and
common
mortar.
template.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So moving on from AC/DC in the 70s, punk rock also takes off as well. And 2 big bands to kind of throw that forward are the Sex Pistols and Ramones. Could you
Yes.
tell us a little bit about the Sex Pistols and their influence?
So the Sex Pistols, Malcolm McLaren, which was their touring manager, he was the manager for the New York Dolls, and back then they were known for their antics, I guess.
Okay.
They would always dress very femininely and wear platform heels, and this was back when everybody was still wearing suits. And then basically Malcolm McLaren got kicked out of the as their manager because he was, I believe he was funneling money like to his personal bank account. So he moved back to the UK. He opened up a store called Sex, and that was like a clothing store for punk rocks and people who liked the New York Dolls. And that's where he found Steve Jones, which was the guitarist for the Sex Pistols. And Steve Jones at the time did not know a single thing about guitar. He learned all the guitar songs that he was playing on the record in like 6 months, and it's actually impressive.
Okay, so the mid-70s punk rock scene is sort of the stereotypical kind of like motif of anti-establishment, kind of going against the grain sort of thing. And like you said earlier, not wearing suits anymore. Is this sort of the beginning of the rock and roll aesthetic?
Yeah, the rock and roll aesthetic that we know of today, yeah.
So what is the rock and roll aesthetic?
So a lot of them would wear like crop tops, and then usually leopard print, a lot of leopard print actually. Usually like tiger furs or something like that.
Right.
Clout goggles as one of the things.
Yeah.
Just a whole bunch of stuff, and they were also, known for their drugs, sex, and rock and roll.
Right. So just kind of trying to be as big of a sore thumb as you can be, standing out against the crowd kind of thing.
Essentially, yeah. They're attention driven.
Would you say that rock and roll, what's the word I want to say? Not format. That rock and roll style still holds true today, or like music as it goes through the decades, has the style progressed throughout the decades as well?
The style progressed throughout the decades as well. You don't
Okay.
see it as much anymore.
All right. So then I guess as we move forward throughout the decades, we'll return to the style and talk about how it's changed as well with the music. Do you have any examples of music from the Sex Pistols that you can give us?
Yeah, so I'll actually compare the two, the Sex Pistols and also the Ramones for you guys.
Okay.
So the Sex Pistols are more rhythmic, I guess. Mm-hmm. And it would be like... So the Ramones, they are from the West Coast and not from the UK. And a lot of their songs actually were just straight to the punch, like nothing else. And a lot of it was...
So with that being played and that example being done, would you say a notable point from the 60s to the 70s is kind of the sped up played of music? Because earlier we're talking more bluesy stuff, kind of taking your time, moseying about kind of thing, and then 70s seems like the more intense in your face being played quicker.
Yeah.
So with the Sex Pistols being explained, and then could you go on to the Ramones a little bit and talk about them?
So the Ramones, it was two brothers, and I believe they played the guitars, the rhythm guitar and the lead guitar, and they kind of just followed from the garage rock bands that we were talking about earlier and created their own sound from that and then started playing like that, and they kind of became the Ramones.
So with the Beatles kind of being the Beatles, Chuck Berry, these people who are the template or groundwork for further things to come, would you say the Sex Pistols and the Ramones are the kind of gold standard being built off of from that, or is there even someone else that the Sex Pistols and Ramones build up from?
They built up from the New York Dolls that we talked about earlier,
Right.
but all three of those pretty much were the ground foundation for what we know as glam metal or hair metal.
Mm-hmm. And then we'll get to glam metal and hair metal later, so
Yes.
moving on from that. We had kind of touched on it earlier about AC/DC being from Australia, and every continent or different country has different sounds. Could you explain the difference between West Coast punk and UK punk and which place it actually originated from? Because I know there's kind of like a debate on that.
Okay, so originally it was the New York Dolls. Then they were from New York.
Mm-hmm.
They were pretty much like the Chuck Berry to punk rock, where they founded it, but it's not there yet.
Yeah.
And then the Sex Pistols came, and the Ramones came, and then the Clash came, and they all kind of revolutionized their own tones and sounds, and that's what became punk rock.
So what are the notable differences between UK and West Coast rock, punk rock?
So West Coast rock, it was very in your face, like I showed you, where it's like very heavy chords, like. And then the UK punk rock scene, they actually were more rhythmic, like I said earlier, and it was more like.
So something you had touched on earlier that now we'll delve a little bit deeper into is that the Sex Pistols and the Ramones kind of, I don't want to say pave the way, but start the maybe genre or style of glam rock. Could you explain glam rock and the stories behind that?
Okay, so glam rock, it was, it's essentially, the way they dressed was very glamorous. They would, poof up their hair with a whole bunch of hairspray and wear makeup and foundation and whatnot. And just the way they acted was, very rock and roll-esque.
Mm-hmm.
And Van Halen pretty much was the first band that started that. And it kind of just got out of control, especially with the West Coast and all the kids going to the clubs down there. And then glam metal became glam metal. And then it went on and on from that, and then it got killed off by Nirvana.
With you explaining glam metal, more of a style, can you explain more of the history behind those big bands playing in clubs and people seeing them and looking up to them?
Sorry. So back in the late 70s, early 80s, there's a place in Los Angeles called the Sunset Strip. And it's essentially the foundation of hair metal, or even just rock and roll in general. And these kids, they would go to the clubs, they would see Eddie Van Halen, Randy Rhoads, who we will get into later, and other, guitarists like that play these insane licks and songs. And they're like, I want to be like that. So they started dressing like the way they did. They started striping their guitars like the way they did. And then they started, just acting like the way they did and started playing exactly like the way they did. And that kind of started glam rock and glam metal.
So the Anybody Who's Anybody is playing Sunset Strip, people going there and seeing inspiration and drawing from it moving forward. So taking a break from glam rock and now going to a different kind of rock that we've also touched upon earlier, progressive rock. Front runners for progressive rock being Rush and Pink Floyd. Before we jump into them and their influence on the game and how their music is played, could you explain what progressive rock is?
So progressive rock, it's very complicated. They use a lot of classical structure. And they pretty much take the basic chords, like for example, the A chord. This is what the A chord sounds like. And they add a second note to it, and it goes. Okay. And it sounds more whole and whatnot, and then they use that in their songs. So for example, I'm going to play Rush right now for you.
Okay. So with you had just saying a few seconds ago that it was a more complex, convoluted play style. Out of the genres to come out of the 70s, would you say that's the most, not game-changing, but more fundamentally challenging genre to come out of it?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's got a lot more moving parts to it than the rest of it.
Oh, yeah.
So with that being said, we touched on progressive rock. Oh, we just talked about progressive rock, but Rush and Pink Floyd. You just played a Rush sample. Could you explain the influence of Rush on the game?
So Rush, they mainly influenced Eddie Van Halen, with the hair metal scene and whatnot. And then they were very complex, especially Alex Lifeson, the guitarist. And so basically, they actually used a lot of effects. So Rush would have a phaser pedal, which is what I have on now, chorus, and a delay. And it sounds like, I'm going to play the same riff so you can see the comparison.
Yeah. So that also more of the evolution and integration of the pedal board, as we had spoken about earlier, changing up the sound of music a little bit. With Rush being like that, is Pink Floyd similar in a sense? Are they kind of the same but different? What would you explain for them?
They're more psychedelic in a sense. Like Rush, they were very, high energetic, easygoing and all that other stuff. And Pink Floyd was more mellow. It was more towards acid trips and, stuff like that. So
the difference between progressive rock being something we had spoken about beforehand, a lot of chord changing. Is there any other kind of genre that uses that to its advantage, or is that more of a staple just for the progressive genre?
Metal actually uses a lot of progressive rock structure.
Okay. So as we had mentioned before, and I guess something we'll touch about now is in hip-hop and music these days, there's a lot of sampling, and people can get rubbed the wrong way or upset with it because it kind of feels like cheating, not coming up with your own thing and using something else, maybe changing it a little bit. But in the world of rock and roll, from what you've told me, that's very widely accepted, is it's not so much of a cutthroat atmosphere. It's everybody's kind of willing to share something and work off of something together. Could you go a little bit more in depth about that? And as we've spoken about before, the sharing and revolutionizing of bands from other bands.
So rock and roll and just music in general is based off of reinvention. There's no such thing. I mean, you can copy riffs and whatnot, but you can play them in your own style.
Okay.
And that you would reinvent something. Like, for example, the tapping, which we will get into later.
Yeah.
You want to get into it now, actually?
We're almost there. Okay, we'll get to it.
So later I'll talk about it. But,
Okay, yeah.
rock and roll is just about reinvention. So
Right.
basically, it's kind of widely accepted that times can change and whatnot. I mean, of course, there are some people that aren't accepting about that,
Yeah.
like especially the older generation. Like, for example, I'm not gonna, whatever. Gene Simmons from Kiss.
Okay.
He pretty much said rock is dead. It was killed by the new rock stars that are coming out and whatnot. But honestly, rock is still there, and it's still kicking alive with Mac DeMarco and all those other bands.
Okay. So now getting more towards the end of the 70s, this is the big deal with rock and roll, the blueprint for everybody else. Van Halen comes onto the scene. Could you explain the significance of Van Halen and what it means to the rock and roll game?
So Van Halen, Eddie Van Halen is the guitarist. So he took a Jimmy Page lick from one of his songs and he played it like, so Jimmy Page, he'd play something like this. And then Eddie Van Halen's like, what if I use this finger as the nut so I can change the, like the frequency? And you go. And then he said, that's a little too complicated. So what if I move my finger down here? So he came up with something like this.
So is it safe to say that Van Halen invented tapping?
Essentially, yeah.
Okay. And that genre, or that style of music being played, tapping, obviously. So, Van Halen, moving onward, foundation for all rock songs. They introduced the new method, tapping, of course, and they bring updated covers from old songs to a new generation, like You Really Got Me. Could you explain that for us?
So You Really Got Me was the Kinks song that I played earlier. For a reminder, I'll play it again for you guys. And it goes like... And then Van Halen came on the scene and they created their own version to appeal to the modern generation because they grew up on that music. But they wanted to appeal to the teenagers now.
Yeah, change it.
So they played it like this.
Just a little something.
Yeah, just a little something.
Just a little something to play. So, as we've spoken about before, Van Halen becomes such a gold template. It's such a big deal for rock and roll becoming, progressing throughout the years. And something that we've also talked about is Van Halen himself being such a perfectionist. Before we move on to the 80s, could you talk about the Eminem story?
Okay, so in the Van Halen concerts, they would have like these huge lights, like thousands and thousands of lights, pyrotechnics, and all this other stuff. So they needed it to be right, or else something bad will happen. So what they would do in their contract is they would write in very small fine print, no brown M&Ms in the M&Ms bowl. So if they went into the green room and they saw brown M&Ms, then they knew that they didn't read the contract thoroughly, and they would usually force the gig to completely redo everything, reset everything up, or they would even just withdraw from the show and get all their money back.
That's how much of a perfectionist and how much he wants it to be right playing forward. So now we're at the end of the 70s, moving into the early 80s with a different genre of music. As we've said numerous times already, Van Halen becomes a new gold standard for rock moving forward. Could you explain coming onto the scene, Randy Rhoads, Quiet Riot, and then Ozzy Osbourne breaks away from his band Black Sabbath, how they try to not necessarily copy but keep up with Van Halen's sound?
So Randy Rhoads, he started Quiet Riot. They're known for, Come On, Feel the Noise. And he started it in 1974, same with Van Halen. And then Randy Rhoads broke away from the band from 1978. and he just kind of became a guitar teacher because he's classically influenced and whatnot. And then in 1980, Ozzy Osbourne recruited him to make a solo record. And the solo record, so back then, if you broke away from a very successful band and you made a solo record, you're done for, like your career is over.
Right.
And then Ozzy Osbourne came back and he recruited Randy Rhoads as his guitarist, and they made, I believe it was Blizzard of Oz, and that pretty much is one of the best rock albums of all time.
So we're gonna stick with that and then come back to something else. Ozzy Osbourne breaks away from his band and, like you said, ends up making sensational music. A very big staple song for the 80s and for rock and roll in general would be
Crazy Train.
Do you want to give us an example of Crazy Train?
Yes, I shall. So Crazy Train, it's very complex. They took a lot of progressive rock stuff and then they kind of, did their own thing with it. So Crazy Train went a lot like. God damn it.
Oh no.
All right, so let me switch guitars real quick.
All right, as Cameron was playing, we had one of his guitar strings break, so he's gonna switch to something else. Do you want to restring it, and that can be part of it?
No, because
No?
that's gonna take like 20 minutes.
Okay. All right, Cameron's gonna change his guitar real quick to get a different one, and then we'll keep
I just
going.
spent $10 on those strings too.
And you just changed it the other day. Like,
Yeah,
you just
literally
fixed it.
Saturday.
Huh.
Literally Saturday.
So as you're redoing that, is there, besides anything that we wouldn't know, not having the musical background, is there any reason why Crazy Train is such a big influential song
Right.
to the genre?
So like I said earlier, like if you're a solo artist, you're over. Like you're done.
Right.
So when Ozzy Osbourne released that song, it was everywhere. It was on MTV and all this other stuff, and it pretty much gave him a second redemption.
So it's not so much about like the fundamental, what makes the song, but it's more of the impact of him surviving being solo. So Ozzy Osbourne breaks away on his own, does his own thing, and then we have more bands coming onto the scene being part of it. Motley Crue, another one being coming from the garage kids, garage band background. Could you explain Motley Crue for us?
So Motley Crue, they took a lot of inspiration from the Sex Pistols and specifically the Ramones, and also a lot from Van Halen. And they pretty much wanted to be like Black Sabbath, where they wanted to create scary music, heavier music, but like, keep it consumer friendly, kind of. Very kind of.
Okay.
So they basically, 1981, that's when Van Halen and all that got huge and big from the Sunset Strip. So they were from the Sunset Strip, and they lived actually a block away from the Sunset Strip, and they would practice in their garage and whatnot. And then the time came in 1981, and they became Motley Crue at a show called the Roxy.
So coming up into the 80s is the continual evolution of genres from rock. We still have metal being a big forerunner, but then we also have thrash and hair coming onto the scene. With the song you played, Crazy Train from Ozzy Osbourne, has his genre evolved at all, or is that still metal? What is it now?
Yeah, it's more hairy, I guess, more hair metal.
More hair metal?
Yeah.
So then, that being said, could you explain why it's called hair metal?
So hair metal, it's literally called hair metal because their hair would be all over the place. But it originated from, the Sunset Strip with Van Halen and all of that.
Okay.
And it kind of just stuck.
All right. And then Motley Crue's genre of music, same, different?
I consider it hair metal, yeah.
Still hair metal?
Yeah.
Okay. So now with that being said, moving more towards into the mid-'80s, you kind of, not much as contenders, but the three mainstream of rock is going to be pop, thrash, hair, and I guess metal, you kind of...
Yeah, it's about the same.
Okay, so 4, I suppose. You have big pop songs. Well, actually, before we move into that, could you explain the backstory between Van Halen and Michael Jackson with the pop song?
So Eddie Van Halen, the guitarist, he went into the studio to pick up I believe it was a microphone or an amplifier from the studio producer. And he saw Michael Jackson and he was recording Beat It. And Eddie Van Halen's like, hey, let me make a solo and kind of rewrite it a bit. And that became the Beat It that we know of, that's on the radio.
And when he made the song for Michael Jackson or made the solo demo for him, what was the reasoning behind him not wanting to be credited for the song?
So when Van Halen, they took a lot of things seriously in Van Halen, for example, the Brown M&Ms. So they pretty much said, if you're in Van Halen, you're not going to do any solo gigs at all. And that's why he's pretty much uncredited on every single solo record of,
So was it not until way later afterward that his other band members found out that he did that, or was it something he told them right away, or?
I believe it was just like, you can't be credited, but...
You just can't be credited.
Yeah,
okay. It's not like you have to keep it secret or something.
But a lot of people back then didn't know it was Eddie Van Halen, so there's a story where Eddie Van Halen went to Tower Records in Sunset Boulevard, and two kids are like trying to debate, like, it has to be Eddie Van Halen, like, because the song was over the radio. And then Eddie Van Halen came up behind me and he's like, yeah, that was me.
Yeah, a little, yeah, that was me there. So could you play us the example from just Beat It?
Yes, so Beat It, it's a very simple song.
So, as we've said before, very big staple songs in the 80s, kind of the, what would you consider like the peak? Probably like 80s kind of peak rock. Like
1984,
really,
probably.
1980,
yeah.
Specifically 1984.
Yeah.
Why 1984 in specific?
Because that was Van Halen's last record with their singer, and also Motley Crue's Shout Out the Devil came out, and that was a huge record when it came out. And also Michael Jackson, I believe he released a record in 1984, and that's kind of like a staple record as well.
So that's a big year for music.
Yeah.
Another very big staple song for the 80s that lays a foundation for the rest of rock and roll would be Panama.
Yes.
Which is by
Van Halen.
Would you like to play Panama for us?
Yes, I would.
All right.
So, Panama.
Nice. So something I noticed with your new guitar that you don't have, the, what do you call it, whammy bar?
Yeah, the whammy pedal.
Whammy
bar.
Whammy bar?
Yeah.
When, I didn't even think about that. That hasn't always been on guitars, obviously.
Well, it actually started off with this guitar. So history lesson, this was actually a jazz guitar.
Oh, perfect timing, yeah.
Yeah.
We meant to do that.
So so this was pretty much like the standard jazz guitar back then, and they had a tremolo bar, but it didn't do what that did.
Right.
If that made sense. And it would just kind of like do something like this. And then when things got, more creative, they made the Stratocaster, which is that red one right there. And they added a whammy bar that goes all the way down, and that's where you can do the crazy tricks. But the only problem is that the strings would go out of tune when you do that.
Right.
So it was Floyd Rose, that's the name of a guy. He made a Floyd Rose, and that's what's on that guitar. And it locks the tuners up here and also down here.
Right.
So it doesn't go out of tune.
And when did that come into play? What, if we were to put it decade-wise?
79, 81.
Okay, so late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, for Floyd Rose.
Are you tuning the guitar?
Yeah.
Okay. So also in 80s, still talking about more popular songs, and I was going to ask you to play them to show the difference between the two of them. So like Master of Puppets being Thrash, Panama being Hair, which we just listened to, and then Hammer to Fall. If you could play through the other two, I guess now, because you did the third already, and show us the difference between them.
Okay, so Master of Puppets was thrash metal. It was very effect light, so they would literally just use a chorus, and then they'd probably turn this all the way up like that, and that down, and then it would sound a lot like.
And then changing gears, could you play us the sample from Hammer the Fall to show the difference?
So
between the two of
Hammer
them?
the Fall, okay.
Kind of like a more lighthearted.
Yeah, it's more lighthearted, it's more poppy. I guess it's considered pop rock.
Yeah. Other honorable mentions coming out of the decade that have made a big difference to the game. You just played Queen here, Van Halen. We've got Metallica, Iron Maiden. Do you have any other samples of songs you want to play?
I think we're good so far.
Okay, moving on then. Now getting towards the end of the 80s, we're getting into sleaze metal. Could you explain sleaze metal?
So sleaze metal is kind of a term that my friends and I came up with. I mean, originally, sleaze metal does exist.
Right.
It's based off of the hair metal in the 80s, but it's from Sweden.
Okay.
But the way they dress and all that is sleazy, so they call it sleaze metal in Sweden. But sleaze metal, I consider it's Guns N' Roses because it wasn't as heavy as thrash and it wasn't as chorusy and effect heavy as hair metal. It was like right in between the two. So
weird soft spot.
Yeah, they didn't dress like the hair metal guys. They dressed like the thrash guys, but they would play like the hair metal guys.
Okay. Could you give us an example of sleaze metal?
Yeah, so sleaze metal. That's a tough one.
Yeah, a little bit of a hard one to play.
Yeah, my fingers are too big.
So, sleaze, does it ever really take off as big as the other genres? Is it kind of like big for a short period of time and comes down, or?
It was big until 1991 when grunge came out, essentially.
All right, so that's the perfect segue.
Yeah.
Now we're into the 90s with grunge. And who's the king of grunge?
Probably Kurt Cobain and Nirvana.
All right, so if you want to explain Nirvana coming onto the scene for us.
So Nirvana, instead of coming from Sunset Strip and sunny Los Angeles, they came from Aberdeen, Washington State. So hair metal was more about having a good time and partying and all this stuff, and then Nirvana, especially Kurt Cobain, they were more focused on like real world issues. Like a lot of their songs were based off of like real murder cases and whatnot, and they kind of took the pain from the victims and the victims' families, and they wrote songs about it, and it became grunge.
So it's another. It seems like it's a big reflection of the artist's surroundings, like you said, from where they're from.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of another sort of anti-establishment. They're making real songs about real stories that are very heavy topics, so kind of influencing. Besides Nirvana, is there any other big person or band that contributes to grunge, or is it just kind of their thing?
Probably Alice in Chains is another big one.
Are they ever at the same level, or is one a little bit higher than the other?
Nirvana is probably the most popular one.
Okay, so do you have any samples of Nirvana you want to play?
Yes, I do.
So now with grunge taking off, hair metal and maybe that kind of area of rock is kind of dying out in general. Grunge kind of taking up now with soft rock, but that all kind of comes to a pretty quick end with Kurt Cobain passing away, and then grunge sort of dies with him.
Yeah.
So after that happens, post-grunge comes out with big bands like Foo Fighters and Weezer. Can you explain the major fundamental differences between grunge and post-grunge?
So grunge took or post-grunge took the heavy aspects from grunge, but they kind of shifted back to the hair metal lyrics a little bit. I mean, it wasn't too much about the partying and having a good time, but it was more about like the heartbreak songs and whatnot.
Okay.
And post-grunge is, essentially what came after grunge, hence the name post-grunge.
So you've just given us a demo of grunge. Could you give us an example of post-grunge so we can hear the difference?
Yes, post-grunge.
So, moving on from there, White Stripes comes onto the scene, kind of brings the kind of punk garage feel back. And as we've mentioned earlier with the 80s, big staple songs, big songs that mean a big deal. Big song in the 90s contributing to rock would be
Seven Nation Army.
And if you could play that for us, please, and kind of explain why it's so impactful. Could you explain for us in that post-grunge, punk, garage band era why that song is such a significant song to that time period?
So rock was pretty much dead. It was just new metal like Limp Bizkit and Korn and whatnot. And when the garage rock scene came back on, it was actually from Detroit, believe it or not from Los Angeles or Seattle.
Okay.
It kind of started a thing with the UK with a second British invasion, kind of like what the Beatles and whatnot went through. And then we got bands like Oasis and whatnot. But the two high key staples of garage rock would probably be the Black Keys and the White Stripes. But that's just because they were the ones that pretty much started it.
Okay. So with the 60s, 70s, and 80s rock, and we had spoken about how from different continents, different countries, there's different sounds. With this post-grunge kind of era, is there a big distinction between different places and different sounds, or is it all sort of the same thing?
It's kind of sort of coming together now because the internet exists now. So.
Okay, so it's reaching a wider audience and it's not as differentiated.
Yeah.
Okay, so kind of a quick one through the 90s, and now we're getting up to the 2000s and 2010s now. We have the White Stripes, as we mentioned, kicking off garage rock with songs like Screwdriver and Are You Gonna Be My Girl? You want to play those?
So Screwdriver and Are You Gonna Be My Girl are actually from two bands. So Screwdriver was from the White Stripes, and Are You Gonna Be My Girl is from the Jet. But so basically what happened was the White Stripes, they got really popular after Seven Nation Army and their other albums. And the record label saw that, and they kind of wanted to make their own band, so they made the Jet essentially. And they were pretty much the White Stripes from the UK. And both songs actually start out exactly the same, and they sound exactly the same. So I'm just going to play them both at once.
Okay. Oh, all right.
So it goes like...
With punk rock and garage rock taking more of a staple in the early 2000s and 2010s, could you give us the major differences between the two? Because like there were two songs that you played that they sound roughly the same. What's the major differences between them?
So punk in the 90s was very consumer based. Like we had Green Day they were there to appeal to the consumers so they can sell more records. And then the White Stripes kind of changed that a bit because they, had their own record label and all that other stuff.
Okay.
And then Columbia signed them on in the early 2000s, and the rest is history.
So by this time period, or this time in general, rock has started beginning to die out, and as we've mentioned, it always has to evolve to keep up with the new times and changing of the music scene. Rock's starting to die out and indie rock is coming out. I know I've asked you a million times the fundamentals of things and whatever, but once again, what are the staples of indie rock that make it indie rock?
So indie rock, it kind of goes back to that garage rock aspect where it's just people in their garage having a good time. But since this is the time of the internet and SoundCloud exists, they kind of made their own record labels in a sense with SoundCloud, and they just get the royalties from SoundCloud from listens. And probably the most notable one would be Mac DeMarco.
Right, and then Tame Impala coming out. So it's the time of indie and contemporary rock sort of becoming the new mainstream thing. Do you have any contemporary rock that you could play for us?
Yes.
So now getting more up to current times and where we are now with the rock genre, what do you personally think, kind of the age-old question now, is rock dying, has rock died out, or if it's not, where do you think it's going in the future?
So we talked about this earlier. Rock and roll is about reinvention, so it's just waiting for somebody to create a new sound or something new to bring to the table, and then of course once somebody creates something new, everybody wants to try to recreate that sound, so they're going to make their own sounds, and so on and so on. And with that, I genuinely do not think rock and roll is dead. It's still staying alive with Mac DeMarco and all the smaller bands that you find on Instagram and like playing at your local clubs. You just need to go out and look for a good band.
So would you say right now is sort of that weird in-between time where we're waiting for it to find its new identity to go up to a new peak?
Yes.
And I think something you and I had spoken about before as well is it seems nowadays there is a sort of weird fusion going on between hip-hop and rock and roll, putting it together with artists like Kenny Mason, XXXTentacion putting more heavier chords and rock and roll in their songs. So I think that may be the weird in-between we're in when we start integrating it a little bit more and bringing it back to a more mainstream. With that being said, that is the end of our time coming through the decades here now. So Cameran is going to play the blues song that we mentioned earlier. And as he plays it, he is going to go through the different decades and go through the different samples of how rock has evolved throughout the years. So without further ado, I'll let him take it away. this section for our time here. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back to have Cameron do his guitar demonstration and talk to us about the different kinds of guitars and how they're played and what they mean. So we are going to take a quick break. Stay seated, and we'll be right back. Thank you.